We've been best friends since we were 5 years old. Everyone around us seemed convinced we were secretly in love, except for the two of us. I first met Leo when his family moved into the house next door. My mom insisted I bring over a plate of cookies to welcome them. I found him sitting alone on the front steps, clearly upset about leaving his old friends behind. Try and cheer him up? I told him he could borrow my friends if he wanted. He wrinkled his nose and said girls had cooties, so naturally I dumped the entire plate of cookies over his head. Somehow, that was the beginning of everything. From that day on, we were inseparable. For the next 13 years, there was almost nothing we didn't do together. Every morning, he walked me to school, even when the other boys teased him for hanging around with a girl. I attended every one of his baseball games, including the away games that meant sitting on a bus for 3 hours. I had a tradition of painting his jersey number across my cheeks and yelling louder than any of the actual girlfriends in the bleachers. People constantly assumed we were dating, and every single time we laughed it off like the idea was absurd. We weren't boyfriend and girlfriend. We were simply Leo and Julia, which somehow felt both smaller and bigger than any label people try to give us. By high school, everyone became even more determined to push the idea. His teammates insisted I was obviously in love with him, while my friends swore the way he looked at me was different from how he looked at other girls. We just roll our eyes and explain for what felt like the 100th time that growing up together basically made us siblings. I knew every embarrassing thing about him, like the fact that he cut chunks of cheese straight from the block at 2 in the morning, and he'd already seen me through chickenpox, braces, and the horrible perm I got sophomore year. You don't date the person who helped you hold a funeral for your hamster in 3rd grade. College was the first thing that nearly pulled us apart. Leo got accepted into State University for engineering, while I enrolled in an art school 40 minutes away to study graphic design. The first few weeks were awful. I'd call him in tears because my roommate was impossible to live with, and he'd show up at midnight carrying soup whenever I got sick. He texted me during lectures complaining about a lab partner who kept flirting with him, asking how to reject her without sounding cruel. To survive the distance, we made a promise that no matter how busy life became, we'd have dinner together every Sunday. Sometimes we met halfway at this terrible little diner with awful food, but it was exactly 20 minutes from both campuses. Those weekly dinners became the one thing keeping me grounded. Then junior year changed everything. Leo started dating a girl from his program named Becca. She was beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely kind, which somehow made everything hurt more. For the first time in 16 years, someone else mattered more to him than I did. He still showed up for our Sunday dinners, but now half his attention stayed glued to his phone because he was texting her. When I called him crying over a failed project, he told me he couldn't talk because he was at Becca's apartment. I kept telling myself this was healthy and normal and that I should be happy for him because he'd found someone wonderful. Eventually, I started dating too. Daniel, a guy from my painting class, was funny, caring, and completely unlike Leo. The four of us started going on painfully awkward double dates where everyone seemed desperate to force comfort that wasn't naturally there. Becca would ask questions about how long Leo and I had known each other and smile about how adorable our friendship was, as if it were some quirky little novelty. Daniel constantly tried to fit into jokes and memories he could never fully understand. Meanwhile, Leo and I could barely meet each other's eyes without feeling guilty toward the people sitting beside us. Everything finally fell apart during senior year when Becca got accepted into a graduate program in California. She wanted Leo to move there with her after graduation. She gave him this long speech about leaving childhood attachments behind so that they could begin their real future together. The childhood attachment she meant was me. Leo told me all of this during one of our Sunday dinners. I forced myself to smile and told him he absolutely should go because Becca was incredible and California would offer amazing opportunities for engineering jobs. He stared at me for what felt like forever before quietly saying, "I guess you're right." That night, I went back to my dorm room and cried so hard my roommate threatened to call health services. 2 weeks later, Daniel ended our relationship. He told me he couldn't keep pretending he was okay being someone's second choice when it was obvious I loved someone else. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to argue with him and tell him he was wrong. But deep down, some hidden part of me already knew he wasn't. Then, 1 week before graduation, Leo appeared outside my apartment at 3 in the morning. Normally, that wouldn't have been strange, except this time he was completely sober and looked absolutely shattered. He told me he had ended things. He told me he had broken up with Becca because she forced him to make a choice between moving to California with her or staying close to me, and he realized he couldn't choose her. I immediately told him he was crazy for throwing away his future over a friendship, and that's when he looked at me and said quietly that this was exactly the problem. I wasn't just his friend anymore, and honestly, I hadn't been for a very long time. Then he kissed me. The second I pulled away, my entire body started trembling. Leo was looking at me with this expression that mixed fear and hope together, and suddenly I forgot how to breathe properly. We had crossed a line we could never step back over, and deep down I knew everything between us had changed forever. My mind desperately searched for something smart or meaningful to say, but the only thing that came out was asking whether he had really ended things with Becca because of me. He nodded immediately, like the answer should have been obvious all along, and my stomach twisted hard. We stayed sitting there on the steps outside my apartment, not touching each other at all, just staring in silence while my heartbeat pounded so loudly it filled my ears. His hair was messy, and there were dark circles under his eyes that made him look exhausted, like he hadn't slept properly in days. Part of me wanted to kiss him again immediately, while another part wanted to run as far away as possible. Eventually we went inside, but instead of sitting close together, we stayed on opposite ends of the couch because I was too nervous to be anywhere near him. The entire night, we talked without touching once. Leo admitted he'd been in love with me since sophomore year of high school, ever since I showed up to one of his baseball games while sick with the flu, just because I'd promised I would be there. He said he spent years convincing himself those feelings were only friendship because I never acted like I wanted anything more. I listened to him feeling completely ridiculous because I had spent years insisting to everyone that we were basically siblings, while apparently both of us had known the truth the entire time. When it was finally my turn to speak, I admitted Daniel had been right. I really had been in love with someone else all along. I told Leo the first just couldn't admit to myself that the person was him until he kissed me that night. We kept talking until sunlight slowly started pouring through my apartment window. At some point, exhaustion caught up to both of us, and we fell asleep on opposite sides of the couch with our feet almost touching in the middle. The next morning, Raina walked into the apartment and found us there fully dressed and asleep. She took one look at us and instantly demanded an explanation. I was still barely awake when I mumbled that Leo and I had kissed, and she literally screamed loud enough for the neighbor next door to pound on the wall. She kept repeating that everyone had been waiting for this moment since we were kids, and that she always knew it would happen eventually. Her reaction somehow made everything feel frighteningly real, because now it wasn't just between Leo and me anymore. Other people knew, and there was no way to undo it. Raina made coffee and sat there smiling like she was watching her favorite movie while Leo and I awkwardly avoided making eye contact. Then she casually asked when our first date was, and I realized neither of us had actually discussed what any of this meant yet. After Leo left to change clothes, Raina told me I looked both happy and terrified at the same time, which honestly felt completely accurate. Later that day, Leo texted me asking if I wanted to get coffee near campus. An actual date. I stared at the message forever before replying yes, even though my hand was shaking while I typed. We met at a coffee shop we'd gone to hundreds of times before, but suddenly everything about it felt unfamiliar and strange. I kept slipping into our normal best friend conversations, talking about my design project and asking questions about his engineering lab, before abruptly remembering that we were supposed to act romantic now. I was so nervous that I knocked over my coffee twice. The second time, it spilled all across the table, and Leo immediately jumped up to grab napkins. While we walked back toward campus, he reached for my hand. I let him hold it. His hand felt warm and familiar, but also strangely wrong at the same time, like we were pretending to belong inside someone else's relationship. I couldn't stop thinking about how many times we'd held hands as kids, but this felt entirely different, and I had no idea how to act differently with Leo. A week passed, and we were still struggling to figure out how to be a couple instead of just best friends. One afternoon, Leo came over to study and casually mentioned that after graduation, I should start applying for graphic design jobs near wherever he ended up working. Something inside me immediately snapped. I told him I wasn't Becca, and I wasn't going to rearrange my entire future just because he suddenly decided we were together now. He looked genuinely hurt and said he only wanted us to live in the same city, but underneath his words I could hear the real expectation. He assumed I would be the one making sacrifices, moving away, and giving things up. That led to our first real argument right there in my apartment with textbooks and papers scattered everywhere around us. Leo accused me of being unfair. I told him he was selfish, but both of us knew the fight wasn't actually about jobs or cities. We were terrified. He left without kissing me goodbye, and the second the door closed behind him, I felt sick to my stomach. The following weeks became miserable as graduation got closer, and our future stopped being theoretical. Suddenly, we had to make real decisions. I ended up getting a job offer I received an offer from this incredible design firm located in a city 2 hours away, and I wanted that job more than anything. I could practically taste how badly I wanted it. Leo had offers too, both near home and in the same city where I'd been offered my position. When I told him about my opportunity, he immediately said he'd stay local instead. He tried to explain it away by saying he wanted to remain close to his family, but I could see the truth written all over his face. He was already beginning to resent the decision he'd made with Becca, and now he was preparing to make that exact same sacrifice for me. We ended up having this long and exhausting conversation where I told him I needed him to build a life he genuinely wanted instead of constantly shaping his future around mine. Leo went quiet for a while before finally asking if I even wanted to be with him anymore. I told him yes, of course I did, but not like this. Not if it meant he would keep giving things up and eventually blame me for it later. Leo's graduation party took place at his parents' house, and throughout the entire evening people kept congratulating us for finally ending up together. At one point, his sister Araya pulled me aside near the kitchen and quietly asked whether I was truly certain about this relationship. She told me Leo had spent most of his life making decisions based on what he thought I wanted, and she worried he no longer understood who he was without me. Her words stayed with me for the rest of the night. I watched Leo laughing and talking with relatives across the room, and suddenly I realized I'd been so focused on my own fears that I hadn't noticed he might actually be losing himself in all of this. When we were kids, he dumped out his juice box because I casually mentioned I didn't like that flavor. At 12, he quit chess club because I once said it seemed boring. At 18, he gave up California because of me. Araya was right, and I had absolutely no idea how to fix it. 2 months after graduation, Leo was working at a small local engineering company, and it was obvious he hated every second of it. Whenever I visited on weekends, he seemed exhausted and irritated, constantly complaining about his boss and the dull projects they kept assigning him. One night, I got up to use the bathroom and caught him scrolling through California job postings on his laptop. I finally asked him directly whether he regretted not going with Becca after all. He stayed silent for a very long time before admitting that sometimes he wondered what his life might have looked like if he'd chosen differently. That conversation lasted until morning. For the first time, we stopped discussing what we thought we were supposed to want and started talking honestly about what we actually wanted. Leo admitted he felt trapped. I admitted I felt guilty all the time. By the end of the conversation, we both knew something needed to change. Eventually, we decided to try long distance, so Leo could accept a much better engineering position 3 hours away. The first month was miserable. We were so used to being part of every second of each other's lives that suddenly scheduling phone calls felt unnatural and awkward, like we were strangers trying to maintain a connection. Leo would call during his lunch break while I was stuck in the middle of meetings at work. I'd text him late at night, only to realize he'd already gone to sleep because he had to be up early the next morning. I buried myself in work projects and slowly started becoming friends with people from my design firm. On weekends, we'd visit art galleries together, and sometimes I'd suddenly realize I was genuinely enjoying myself without Leo there beside me. That realization felt both freeing and heartbreaking at the same time. I hadn't expected to enjoy having space, but the distance gave me room to figure out who I was outside of being Leo and Julia. For months in a long distance, we barely talked anymore beyond quick updates about work and schedules. One afternoon, I went out for coffee with my coworker Caleb. Somehow, a simple coffee run turned into an hour-long walk around the city while we talked about music, design, random childhood stories, and absolutely nothing important. When I finally got home that evening, I realized something unsettling. I hadn't thought about Leo once all day. That night when he called, our conversation felt stiff and strangely empty. He talked about some project at work. I told him about a client presentation. Both of us sounded polite, but neither of us sounded real anymore. It felt like we were just repeating the motions because we didn't know how to stop. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, wondering when talking to my best friend had started feeling like another task on my schedule. I almost texted him to say I missed him, but then I stopped because I honestly wasn't sure if it was true anymore. The following week, someone from work mentioned a pottery class nearby, and on impulse, I signed up for it. I figured, why not? The studio smelled like wet clay, and there were maybe 8 people sitting awkwardly at pottery wheels looking just as lost as I felt. The instructor was an older woman with gray hair tied into a messy bun who kept saying things like, "Feel the clay. Don't try to control it." It sounded fake and overly philosophical, but weirdly enough, it actually helped. My first bowl ended up looking more like a flattened pancake than pottery. But for those 2 hours, I didn't care at all because I wasn't thinking about Leo or our strange in-between relationship or any of the confusion surrounding my life. I was only focused on keeping my hands steady. After that, I started going every Thursday evening. By the 3rd class, I could finally make something that vaguely resembled a mug. The people that were friendly in that casual, temporary kind of way where everyone chats while working, but nobody really exchanges phone numbers. There was a guy named Noah who worked in accounting and a woman named Sarah who taught middle school, and we'd laugh together about how terrible our pottery creations looked while we cleaned up afterward. On Fridays, I started going to the downtown art market with a few people from my design firm. We'd wander through rows of vendor booths carrying overpriced coffee while I bought tiny paintings and handmade jewelry I absolutely didn't need. Slowly, my apartment started filling with things that had nothing to do with Leo. They were items I chose simply because I liked them, not because they connected to some memory we shared together. One night, my coworker Caleb invited me to his birthday party, and even though I barely knew anyone going, I decided to show up anyway. I ended up spending almost an hour talking with his roommate about graphic novels, and when I finally got home later that night, I realized something strange. I genuinely had fun without checking my phone, even once to see whether Leo had texted me. The strange part was that it felt liberating and terrible at the exact same time. Every time I laughed at a joke Leo hadn't heard or made plans he wasn't included in, this tiny feeling of guilt would settle in my chest. It was like some part of me believed I was supposed to save every meaningful moment for him, even though logically I knew that made no sense at all. For my entire life, I had built my identity around being Leo and Julia. Now suddenly I was just Julia, and I honestly couldn't tell whether that feeling was growth, grief, or somehow both at once. 3 months in a long distance, my phone rang at 11 on a Tuesday night. That alone felt strange because Leo and I had stopped calling each other unless we planned it ahead of time. I almost ignored the call, but something made me answer anyway. At first, I could barely understand him because he was crying so hard. He kept saying he felt trapped and invisible, like his entire life had been frozen in place, and nothing he did actually mattered anymore. I sat on my bed, clutching the phone, trying desperately to figure out the right thing to say while he explained how everything in his life was technically fine. His job was fine. His apartment was fine. Everything looked fine from the outside, but inside, he felt like he was slowly disappearing. Eventually, he admitted the truth. The only reason he'd accepted that engineering position was because it allowed him to stay close enough to visit me on weekends, not because it was the career path he truly wanted. Then he said something that completely shattered me. He admitted he'd spent most of his life making decisions based on whatever kept him closest to me, and now he no longer knew what he actually wanted for himself. I asked him what he would choose if I weren't part of the equation at all. For so long he stayed silent that I honestly thought the call had disconnected. Finally, in this quiet, exhausted voice, he admitted he didn't know how to want things for himself because loving me had always felt like the only thing that truly mattered. That's when I realized we'd both been making the same mistake. Neither of us had been building our lives around desire. We'd been building them around fear. I had accepted my job partly because it proved I could survive without him. Leo had accepted his because it kept him close enough not to lose me. We were so terrified of losing each other that somewhere along the way we stopped creating actual lives for ourselves. After the call ended, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about how loving someone shouldn't require putting your entire future on hold. But somehow that's exactly what we'd done to each other. 6 months after graduation, we finally had the breakup conversation over video chat. Leo's face on my laptop screen looked exhausted and sad, and I was pretty sure I looked exactly the same. We'd been avoiding the truth for weeks, stretching conversations thinner and thinner until we barely sounded like the same people who once knew everything about each other. Finally, Leo said quietly, "Maybe we rushed into being together when we should have stayed friends." I agreed, even though hearing the words spoken aloud felt like something inside my chest cracking apart. We talked honestly for the first time in months, about how we jumped from best friends to romantic partners without ever learning how to balance both roles. About how we assumed all our shared history meant we could skip the complicated parts of building a relationship, but that's not how relationships actually work. Leo admitted he needed time to figure out who he was without me in his life. And I realized I needed the same thing. We decided on a real break. No calls, no texts, no fake version of space where you still message each other every day pretending it doesn't count. When the call ended, I closed my laptop and sat motionless for a long time just trying to breathe. Then I started crying. And once I started, I couldn't stop. I cried until my face swelled and my throat burned and my chest physically hurt. Losing Leo felt less like ending a relationship and more like losing an actual part of myself, like someone had cut away a limb I'd had since childhood. I had spent more years with him than without him. Now I had to figure out how to exist as a complete person on my own. When Thanksgiving arrived, I drove home dreading the entire weekend. My mom made her usual enormous dinner and invited half the neighborhood over like she always did. While we were washing dishes together afterward, she casually mentioned that Leo was home visiting his family too. The second she said it, my stomach dropped. For the rest of the evening, every sound of a car outside made me tense up. I kept glancing through the window toward his parents' house next door like I was 15 years old again, waiting for him to show up at my door. By Saturday, I barely left my room that Saturday because I was terrified of accidentally running into him while getting the mail or taking out the trash. The idea of seeing Leo face to face after everything felt overwhelming in a way I couldn't explain. Early Sunday morning, I woke up before everyone else and went downstairs to make coffee. I was standing in the kitchen holding my mug when I glanced out the window and immediately froze. Leo was sitting on the front steps of his parents' house. He wore a hoodie and jeans and was just sitting there quietly staring off into space. Then he looked up, noticed me through the window, and our eyes locked. For a second, I couldn't move at all. He looked different somehow, more grounded, more real than he ever had through a phone screen. During the months we'd been apart, it seemed like he had finally started becoming fully himself. I stood there clutching my coffee cup, trying to decide what I was supposed to do. Then he gave me this tiny wave. Before I could overthink it, I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. We ended up sitting on his front steps, talking for 4 straight hours, just like we used to do when we were kids. At first, everything felt awkward. Both of us were overly careful with our words, like we were afraid of saying the wrong thing and breaking whatever fragile piece existed between us. But then Leo started telling me about therapy, and somehow I forgot to feel nervous. He explained that his therapist helped him realize he'd spent most of his life being afraid to want things for himself because some part of him believed needing me made him weak. He said he'd gotten so used to always being the person taking care of me that he completely forgot how to admit his own needs mattered too. I told him about my pottery class and the art markets and all the new routines I'd built for myself. I admitted that part of me had been terrified that creating a life outside of him meant I didn't love him anymore. Then I confessed something I hadn't even fully admitted to myself before. I told him I pushed him away because I was terrified of becoming Becca. I never wanted to be the person who made him sacrifice his dreams for a relationship. Leo nodded and said he understood now. He said both of us had been so busy fearing the wrong things that we ended up running away from the right ones. We spent hours talking about work, our friends, the cities we lived in, and all the small changes that had happened over the last 6 months. Somehow it felt exactly like being best friends again. That same easy rhythm we'd always share before everything became tangled and complicated. But it also felt completely different. This time we weren't pretending anymore. We weren't forcing ourselves into some version of romance or trying to deny feelings that already existed. We were simply Leo and Julia, two people trying to understand who they had become separately before figuring out what they could become together. At one point, Leo pulled out his phone and showed me a job offer he'd received in my city. It was from a respected engineering firm working on projects he genuinely cared about. He told me he had interviewed for the position a month earlier without mentioning it to me because he needed to prove to himself that he was making the decision for his own future. Then he said something that made everything inside me shift. He told me he was accepting the job no matter what happened between us because it was the career he truly wanted, not because of me. For the first time since we were 5 years old, Leo had made a decision entirely for himself. He wasn't following me anymore. He wasn't sacrificing things to stay close to me. He was building a life that genuinely belonged to him, and it just happened that my life existed in the same city. I asked him quietly what that meant for us. He smiled a little and admitted he didn't fully know yet, but maybe we could figure it out together. He said he wanted to try again, but this time differently, without all the fear, guilt, pressure, and history crushing us before we even had a chance to breathe. And when he said it, I realized I wanted the exact same thing. I wanted to see who we could become when we were both complete people, choosing each other freely instead of depending on each other to feel whole. So we agreed to start over slowly after Leo moved to my city in January. This time we would date like normal people. We wouldn't assume 16 years of history meant we could skip the difficult parts of learning each other again. Our first official date happened at a coffee shop near my apartment. I'd been to that coffee shop 100 times before, but never once with him. Leo arrived carrying flowers, which felt so formal and slightly ridiculous that we both ended up laughing the moment we saw each other. We ordered drinks and sat down at a small table near the window. Everything about it was awkward in a strangely good way. We kept slipping into our old best friend rhythm, then suddenly remembering we were supposed to be dating and trying to adjust again. He talked about his new job. I told him about a design project I was genuinely excited about. It was simple conversation, but it felt like we were carefully rebuilding something in real time. When he walked me back to my apartment, he kissed me goodnight at my door. It felt completely different from that first, desperate kiss in my apartment months ago. This time it was calm, intentional, and careful. Less panic, more certainty. Like we both actually understood what we were doing. The next 6 months weren't easy. We had to actively learn how to be a couple while still remaining two separate individuals, and nothing about it came naturally. We argued about balancing time together with time for friends. I had to stop myself from slipping back into old habits where we did absolutely everything side by side. Leo had to learn how to tell me when he needed space instead of quietly withdrawing and disappearing for days. One major fight happened in April when I made plans with my pottery class friends on a night Leo wanted to see me. He accused me of choosing them over him. I told him that was exactly the kind of thinking that had destroyed us before. We didn't speak for 3 days, and I was terrified we were heading right back to where we started. Then he called. He apologized and told me his therapist had helped him recognize that he was falling back into old patterns of fear. We talked everything through and slowly figured out healthier ways to handle conflicts like scheduling and expectations. Gradually, we found a rhythm. We had planned date nights, friend nights, and nights where we each did our own thing without guilt. It was more difficult than before, but also more stable and real. When Leo's company offered him a promotion that required relocating to their California office, he didn't tell me for 2 weeks. I only found out because he accidentally left the offer letter on my kitchen counter. At first, I was hurt that he had kept it from me, but then I realized he was trying, in his own way, to make the decision independently like he should. We talked about it one evening over takeout on my couch. He admitted he had been torn for weeks. The promotion was incredible, but he genuinely loved the work he was doing here. I told him honestly that I would miss him if he left, but I wanted him to choose whatever was best for his career. And this time, I truly meant it. Not out of fear, not out of insecurity, and not because I was trying to avoid being like Becca. I meant it because I genuinely wanted him to have the life he wanted, even if that life didn't perfectly align with mine. He looked at me for a long time and then said he was going to turn it down. Not because of me, but because he genuinely preferred his current team and the projects he was working on. California would have meant starting over, and he didn't want that. I believed him, and that feeling meant everything. 2 years after that first kiss, we found ourselves back at the same diner where we used to have Sunday dinners during college. The food was still terrible, but had become ours in a way nothing else was. Leo was nervous the entire meal, barely touching his burger and dropping his fork twice. I thought maybe we were about to have another serious conversation about our future. Instead, he reached across the table and took my hand. He told me he had spent the last 2 years learning how to be his own person. And the best part, he said, was that becoming his own person only made him want to be with me more. Then he pulled out a ring and asked me to marry him. I said yes, because I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't afraid that loving him meant losing myself. I wasn't worried he would regret me later or that we were repeating old mistakes. We had both become people who could stand alone. And because of that, choosing to stand together finally felt right. We had done the difficult work of separating, growing, and rebuilding ourselves individually. Now we were choosing each other, not out of necessity, but out of genuine want. Planning the wedding became its own kind of reality check about who we had become. I remember sitting with the wedding coordinator, talking through seating charts, and suddenly realizing I was organizing separate friend groups for each of us. My pottery friends, who had never even met Leo. His engineering co-workers, most of whom barely knew me. It hit me then that we weren't those inseparable kids anymore who couldn't function apart. We had full, separate lives now. Our own friendships, our own interests, our own bad days that the other person didn't automatically fix. Leo came home stressed from work one night, and I listened, but I didn't try to solve everything for him. That wasn't my role anymore. Another time, I received a rejection from a gallery, and Leo comforted me without taking it on as his own burden. We were actively choosing each other every single day, rather than simply defaulting to each other out of habit or history. It was harder than I ever imagined back on that couch when he first kissed me. Messy, too, because we actually had to communicate instead of silently understanding everything. But it was infinitely better than the idealized version I once thought I wanted, but was too afraid to believe in. On the wedding day, Araya stood up to give her speech, looking so much like Leo, when he got emotional that it almost made me smile through tears. She spoke about watching us grow up next door, about how she had seen us spend 16 years mastering friendship, and then 2 more years completely rebuilding everything we thought we knew about love and each other. She said she had never seen 2 people fight harder for a relationship or work harder to figure out how to be both independent and together at the same time. Later, when Leo and I danced, his hand steady on my back, I thought about how close we had come to losing each other completely, how we had to break apart, become whole on our own, and then choose each other again from a place of strength instead of fear. Every argument about distance, every period apart, every moment of learning who we were alone had led us here. And standing there, I knew exactly who I was, and I still chose him. He looked at me and smiled, and I knew he was thinking the same thing. We had done it the hard way, the messy way, the way that almost broke us but didn't.